The August air hung thick and heavy over the co-op, smelling of dust, diesel, and the sweet, fermenting scent of cracked corn. Silas Blackwood backed his old Chevy C60 grain truck up to the pit, the truck's straight-six engine grumbling a low, steady rhythm he knew better than his own heartbeat. He felt the familiar shudder as the rear tires bumped the worn wooden blocks. He climbed out, the cab door creaking like an old man's knees, and walked to the back to unlatch the grain door. He was a man made of straight lines and hard angles, his face tanned to the color of worn leather by 40 years under the Iowa sun. The corn flowed out in a golden river, catching the afternoon light. It was a good yield, not a record breaker, but honest. It was his. Every kernel of it, from the seed he'd put in the ground to the fuel in his truck, was paid for. That was a feeling that settled deeper than pride. It was a kind of peace, a bedrock under his feet in a world that felt increasingly like shifting sand. A shadow fell over him. A new sound, a high-pitched, almost arrogant whine of a modern diesel engine cut through the air. A brand-new John Deere 4430, gleaming in the sun, pulled a new Brent grain wagon alongside the pit. The tractor's cab was a bubble of tinted glass, and inside, Silas could just make out the shape of Warren Slater, sitting in what looked like an armchair, a cloud of cool air no doubt surrounding him. Slater killed the engine and stepped down, not with the tired grace of a farmer, but with the swagger of a man who'd just stepped out of a new Cadillac. He was 10 years younger than Silas, with a soft jaw and eyes that were always calculating. He nodded curtly at Silas, his gaze flicking over the aging Silas with a faint, dismissive smirk. "Blackwood," he said, his voice a little too loud. "Still running that old relic? I'm surprised the DOT ain't pulled you over for scrap." Silas didn't rise to the bait. He just kept his eye on the corn pouring from his truck. "She gets the job done, Warren. Never missed a harvest." "Yeah, but how much are you leaving in the field?" Slater gestured back toward the road with his thumb. "My new 7700 combine, she's got a grain monitor. Tells me my loss down to the bushel. You're probably dropping 5-6 bushels an acre with that old corn picker of yours." Silas ran a 4-row new idea picker with a sheller unit, pulled by his 1951 Farmall M. It was slow, it was loud, and on a hot day, the dust and chaff would stick to your sweat until you looked like a creature made of earth. But it was simple. He could fix nearly anything on it with a wrench and a welder. "My books balance at the end of the year," Silas said quietly, not looking at him. "That's the only monitor I need." Slater laughed, a short, sharp sound that had no humor in it. "Your books? I'm talking about progress, man. Efficiency. I just picked up another 80 acres west of you. The old Miller place. Got a loan from the bank at 7%. 7! It's free money, Silas. Land values are going up 10, 15% a year. You can't afford not to borrow." The grain in Silas's truck was down to a trickle. He slammed the metal door shut, the sound echoing across the yard. He turned to face Slater, wiping his dusty hands on his jeans. "There's no such thing as free money, Warren. And that land ain't yours. It belongs to the First National Bank of Grafton County. You're just the hired man working it for 'em." Slater's face tightened. The easy smirk vanished. "You sound just like your old man. He died with patched-up overalls and a 10-year-old pickup truck. I'm building an empire for my kids. My boy won't have to break his back turning wrenches in a cold shed all winter. He'll be managing assets." "My father died with no debt," Silas said, his voice low and steady as the idle on his truck. "He owned this farm, all of it. The dirt, the barn, the house, the machines. When he handed me the keys, he handed me a finished job, not a list of payments. My boy will get the same." Slater shook his head, a look of genuine pity on his face. "You're a dinosaur, Silas. You're sitting on a gold mine, and you're too scared to dig. While you're out there on that open station Farmall, eating dust and getting rained on, I'm in my sound guard cab with the air conditioning and the radio, farming twice the ground in half the time. Who do you think is winning?" He didn't wait for an answer. He turned, climbed back into his climate-controlled throne, and with a turn of the key, the big John Deere roared to life. He pulled the lever for the grain wagon, and a torrent of corn, a stream twice as thick as Silas's, began to pour into the pit. The sound was deafening. It was the sound of money, of leverage, of the new way of farming. Silas watched him for a moment, then walked to the scale house. Old man Hemlock, who had been weighing grain here since before Silas was born, peered over his spectacles. "That Slater boy sure is proud of his new iron," Hemlock said, scratching figures onto a ledger with a pencil stub. "He's proud of the bank's new iron," Silas corrected him. Hemlock grunted. "There's a lot of that going around. Secretary of Agriculture Butts is on the radio every day, telling everyone to plant fence row to fence row. Get big or get out. That's what they're all saying." Silas took his weight ticket. The numbers were good. Solid. He folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. "I'll stick to getting by," he said. Driving home, the setting sun glinting off the hood of the old Chevy, Silas thought about Slater's words. A dinosaur. Maybe he was. His main tractor, the one he used for tillage and planting, was his dad's Farmall M. It had been born in the same year as him, 1951. Its narrow front end, its simple four-cylinder engine, its gear shift lever that you had to wrestle with like an opponent, it all felt like an extension of his own body. He knew its every groan, every shudder. He knew the precise spot on the throttle to set for a smooth idle, and the way the engine note deepened when the two-bottom plough bit into the heavy clay near the creek. That tractor sat in the shed, paid for 30 years ago. It didn't earn interest for a banker. It didn't have a payment book thick as a Bible. When it worked for him. For the Blackwood farm. Slater's big green tractor, for all its power and comfort, worked for the bank first. It had to earn its own massive payment, plus the interest, before a single dime went into Warren Slater's pocket. He knew the men at the coffee shop were starting to talk. They saw Slater's new equipment, the new grain bins going up on his property, the way he bought a new pickup every 2 years. They saw Silas, still driving the same truck his dad bought, still running the same tractors, still patching the same barn roof. They saw caution and called it fear. They saw prudence and called it poverty. Now, before we go any further into this story, I have to ask you folks watching, have you ever known a man like Silas? The kind of man who trusts his own 2 hands and a set of old tools more than a loan officer's promise? The kind who would rather rebuild a carburetor for the 10th time than sign his name on a banknote? Let me know in the comments below. I'm curious to know if that kind of man still exists. The following spring, Silas's philosophy was put to the test. It was a cold, wet April, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes the whole world feel like rust. He was getting the Farmall M ready for planting, wanting to get the oats in as soon as the ground was fit. He went to start it, and instead of the familiar, hearty bark of the C169 engine, he got a sickening crunch, followed by a metallic screech, and then silence. He tried the crank again. Nothing. Just a dead, solid thud. His heart sank. That wasn't a sound you could fix with a new set of points or a clean spark plug. That was deep. Internal. For the next 2 days, the shed became his world. He drained the oil, a silvery sheen of metal shavings glittering in the black fluid. A bad sign. He pulled the valve cover, then the head, the heavy cast iron groaning as he broke the seal. The pistons looked okay. He kept going, deeper into the guts of the machine. He dropped the oil pan, lying on his back on the cold concrete floor, a single bare bulb hanging overhead, casting long, dancing shadows. And then he saw it. A crack in the crankshaft. A hairline fracture, but it was enough. One of the connecting rods had seized and snapped, sending a chunk of metal flying through the engine block, leaving a fist-sized hole in its side. The engine was ruined. Not just broken, but catastrophically destroyed. He sat on the greasy floor, the smell of old oil and cold iron filling his nostrils, and stared at the gaping wound in his tractor. A wave of despair, cold and heavy, washed over him. This was more than a machine. It was his partner. It was his father's legacy. And now it was a boat anchor. He could hear Slater's mocking voice in his head. Still running that old relic? For a moment, he considered the alternative. He could walk into the John Deere dealership in town. He knew they'd greet him like a king. They'd have him sign a few papers, and by afternoon, a brand-new tractor would be delivered to his farm. A tractor with more horsepower, a comfortable cab, a radio. An easy solution. A simple one. All it would cost was his freedom. He thought of his father, a man who believed that debt was a form of bondage. You give another man a claim on your sweat, he used to say, and you're no longer your own master. Silas stood up, wiping his hands on a rag. The despair was gone, replaced by a grim, cold resolve. He wasn't beaten yet. He spent the next day on the phone, the old black rotary phone in the kitchen. He called every tractor salvage yard in a 100-mile radius. Most of them laughed. An engine block for a 51M? Good luck. But finally, a gruff voice from a yard over by the Missouri border said he might have something. Got an old M sitting out in the back 40, the man rasped. Been there since the 60s. Engine's probably seized solid, but the block might be good. Can't promise nothing. The next morning, Silas was on the road in his pickup before the sun was up, his toolbox and a chain hoist rattling in the bed. The salvage yard was a graveyard of forgotten iron, rows upon rows of rusted tractors sitting silent in the weeds, their paint faded, their tires rotted away. It was a sad, beautiful place. He found the M, half swallowed by overgrown sumac. It was in rough shape, but the engine block looked intact. It took him the entire day, working under a relentless sun, to pull that engine. Every bolt was a battle, rusted solid after decades of neglect. He soaked them in penetrating oil, heated them with a torch, and leaned on them with a 4-foot breaker bar until his muscles screamed and the veins stood out on his neck. Finally, late in the afternoon, the engine broke free. He hoisted it into the bed of his truck, paid the salvage man $200 cash, a painful sum, but a fraction of a new tractor payment, and began the long drive home. The work in his shed was just beginning. The salvaged engine had to be torn down, cleaned, and inspected. He used the good block and crankshaft from the salvage engine and combined them with the best parts from his old one, the head, the pistons, the sleeves, which he had replaced just a few years prior. It was a painstaking process, a mechanical surgery performed on a concrete floor. He measured tolerances with a plastigauge, torqued the head bolts in the precise sequence the manual dictated, and set the valve lash by feel, the way his father had taught him. His neighbors drove by and saw the Farmall sitting in pieces, its guts spread across the floor. They saw Silas, covered in grease from head to toe, working late into the night. They shook their heads. Over at the coffee shop, the talk was that Blackwood was finally done for. He'd missed the planting window for oats. He was trying to patch a dead horse. Warren Slater drove by one evening in his shiny new Ford pickup. He slowed down, rolled down his power window, and looked at the scene in the shed. He didn't say anything. He just shook his head with that same look of pity and drove on. The message was clear. A real farmer would have just bought a new one. 2 weeks after it had broken down, 2 weeks of 16-hour days and busted knuckles, Silas put the last bolt back in place. He filled the radiator with coolant and the crankcase with fresh 30-weight oil. He stood back, his whole body aching, and looked at the rebuilt engine. It was a patchwork of old red paint and rusted iron, but it was solid. It was his. He climbed onto the steel seat, pulled the choke, and hit the starter. The engine turned over once, twice, then coughed to life with a plume of blue smoke. It settled into a rough, uneven idle, then smoothed out as it warmed up, the familiar, rhythmic chuffing of the four-cylinder engine filling the shed. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. He was late with his planting, there was no denying it, but he wasn't in debt. As he drove the old M out into the field, the smell of freshly turned earth filling the air, he felt a satisfaction that Warren Slater, in his air-conditioned cab, would never understand. He had faced disaster, not with a checkbook, but with his own 2 hands. He had wrestled with the stubbornness of old iron, and won. The next few years were a whirlwind. The mid-1970s arrived, and with them, the great grain rush. The Soviet Union was buying American wheat and corn by the shipload. Prices at the elevator, which had hovered around $1.25 a bushel for corn for as long as Silas could remember, suddenly shot up to $2, then $3. Land that had been selling for $500 an acre was suddenly $1,000, then $2,000. A kind of gold fever swept through the heartland. It seemed like the good times would never end. Warren Slater was perfectly positioned to ride the wave. He used his rapidly appreciating land value as collateral to borrow more money at what still seemed like reasonable rates. He bought the 80 acres north of Silas, then the 160 to the east. His farm swelled from 300 acres to nearly 1,000. He built a massive new machine shed that dwarfed Silas's old barn. He traded in his 4430 for a brand new John Deere 4640, a monster of a tractor with dual rear wheels and a cab so quiet you could hear the radio at a whisper while pulling a 7-bottom plow. He bought a new Gleaner combine, the biggest they made. He was the poster boy for modern agriculture, the man the bankers and equipment dealers pointed to as a shining example of success. When he drove by Silas's place, he no longer looked with pity, but with a kind of triumphant disdain. His very presence seemed to say, "See, I told you so. This is what you could have had." Silas felt the pressure. Every trip to town was a reminder of his own stagnation in the eyes of his peers. Farmers who had once been his equals were now driving new trucks and talking about winter vacations in Florida. Their wives had new kitchens. Their kids had new cars. Martha, his wife, felt it too. She was a strong woman, raised on a farm just like he was, but she wasn't immune to the talk at the church bake sale or the grocery store. Helen Slater was showing off pictures of their new lake cabin, she told him one night over dinner. "Are we doing the right thing, Silas? It feels like the whole world is passing us by." Silas looked at his wife, at the worry lines etched around her eyes. "We're doing what's right for us, Martha. We own this place. We don't owe anyone a dime. That's worth more than any lake cabin." He didn't sit on his hands. The high grain prices meant he was making more money than ever before. But instead of using it as leverage for loans, he used the cash. He put in 10,000 feet of new drainage tile in the West Field, a back-breaking job he did himself with a rented trencher, but one that would improve his yields for decades to come. He built a new grain bin, a modest 10,000 bushel one, but he paid for the steel and the concrete with a check, not a signature on a loan document. He bought another tractor, but it wasn't new. It was a 10-year-old International Harvester, 806, a powerful, reliable machine he found at an auction. He paid cash for it. It had no cab and the paint was faded, but its diesel engine was strong, and it had cost him less than the down payment on one of Slater's new Deeres. To the outside world, he was a failure, a man who, in the greatest economic boom in agricultural history, was only buying used equipment and tiling his own fields. He was the dinosaur, fiddling with his old iron while the world evolved around him. He was falling behind, a relic of a bygone era. One crisp autumn evening in 1979, Silas was finishing up his soybean harvest. He was working late, the lights of his old John Deere 6600 combine cutting through the darkness. The 6600 was another one of his cash purchases, used but well maintained. As he made a pass along the fence line he shared with Warren Slater, he saw the lights of Slater's operation. It looked like a city. The massive 4640 was pulling a disc chisel, its HID lights turning the night into day. Slater's new Gleaner N6 combine was cutting a swath twice as wide as Silas's, unloading on the go into a grain cart pulled by yet another large tractor. It was an impressive display of capital and power. Silas shut down his combine for a minute to clean a clogged feeder house. In the sudden silence, he could hear the drone of Slater's machines, a constant, powerful hum that echoed across the valley. He also heard something else. The radio in his combine cab, tuned to the station out of Des Moines, was playing the evening news. An announcer's voice, grave and serious, cut through the static. Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker today announced another aggressive hike in the federal funds rate in an attempt to combat runaway inflation. Economists are warning the move could push the prime lending rate above 15%, with significant impacts on agricultural and business loans. Silas froze, a wrench in his hand. 15%. He did the math in his head. The interest on a new tractor would be more than the whole tractor cost just 10 years ago. He thought of Warren Slater, with his empire built on a mountain of loans taken out at 7 and 8%. Most of those would be variable rate loans. The bank wasn't going to just eat that cost. He looked across the field at the brilliant lights of Slater's operation. For the first time, they didn't look like the lights of progress. They looked like the lights of a ship, sailing full steam ahead on a calm sea, completely unaware of the tidal wave that was forming just over the horizon. The powerful drone of those brand-new engines no longer sounded like the hum of prosperity. It sounded like a clock, ticking, and Silas had a cold, sinking feeling that midnight was coming fast. The winter of 1980 was a cold one, but the chill that settled over Grafton County had little to do with the weather. It was a cold that crept in through bank statements and loan notices. The prime rate, a number that had been an abstraction to most farmers, was suddenly the topic of every conversation at the co-op, spoken in hushed, fearful tones. 15% became 18%, then scraped its way toward a terrifying 21%. It was a monstrous, invisible scythe, cutting through the financial heart of the heartland. The talk in the coffee shop changed. The bragging about new combines and four-wheel drive tractors evaporated, replaced by a grim accounting of input costs. The price of diesel fuel doubled. A bag of seed corn that cost $30 last year was now $50. The price of corn at the elevator, however, didn't follow suit. A grain embargo against the Soviets had slammed the door on the export market, and the price tumbled back down to $2 a bushel, then lower. The Golden River had dried up, leaving behind a desert of debt. Silas saw the first real crack in Warren Slater's empire that spring. He was dissing his north field with the old International 806, the steady roar of its diesel engine a familiar comfort. Across the fence, Slater's massive John Deere 4640 sat silent in the middle of a half-planted field. It had been there for 2 days. On the third day, a gleaming white service truck from the dealership in the city pulled into the field. 2 mechanics in clean green uniforms worked on the tractor for hours, their movements precise and practiced. Silas watched from a distance as they pulled a large hydraulic pump, a complex piece of machinery that looked more like it belonged in an airplane than a tractor. Later that week, Silas ran into one of the mechanics at the parts store. "Saw you were out at Slater's place," Silas said, picking up a set of plowshares. The mechanic, a young man named Kevin, whose father Silas knew, sighed and shook his head. "Yeah. Main hydraulic pump went out on his 4640. Fried the whole closed center system. Had to have a new one shipped in from Moline." He lowered his voice. "You want to know what that bill was? Parts and labor? Just shy of $5,000. Silas felt a knot tighten in his stomach. $5,000. That was more than he'd paid for his entire 806 tractor 2 years ago. "You get it paid?" Silas asked quietly. Kevin shrugged. "Put it on his account at the dealership. That account's getting pretty long, I hear." That summer, the sky turned against them. A high-pressure dome settled over the Midwest, and the rain simply stopped. The sun beat down with a merciless intensity, day after day. The corn leaves, which should have been a vibrant, waxy green, curled in on themselves, turning a sickly, pale grey. The tassels emerged weak and scattered, shedding their precious pollen onto dry, unreceptive silks. The soybeans, normally a thick, green canopy by July, were stunted, their pods flat and empty. For Silas, the drought was a body blow. His yields were cut in half. The modest profit he'd hoped for turned into a break-even year at best. He tightened his belt, put off plans to re-roof the barn, and told Martha they'd be making do. It was hard, but survivable. They had no massive interest payments coming due. Their living expenses were low. They would weather it. For Warren Slater, the drought was a death sentence. His 1,000 acres of withered crops wouldn't even come close to covering the interest on his operating loans, let alone the principal payments on his land and machinery. He had leveraged everything on the promise of big yields and high prices. With both gone, he was left exposed, his financial foundations crumbling beneath him. The signs were everywhere. The brand-new Gleaner combine sat in the shed all fall. He couldn't afford the fuel to run it, so he hired a custom harvester to take what little crop he had. The shiny Ford pickup was replaced by a battered, 10-year-old Chevrolet with a noisy muffler. The swagger was gone, replaced by a haunted, hollowed-out look in his eyes. He stopped coming to the coffee shop. The whispers followed him anyway. The bank had sent him a registered letter. He was trying to refinance, but no one was lending money to farmers, not anymore. The empire was collapsing. The final act came on a cold, blustery Saturday in March of 1982. A notice had been posted in the paper and on the bulletin board at the co-op. A foreclosure auction at the Warren Slater farm. Silas felt a profound sadness as he drove his old pickup down the familiar road. He wasn't going to gloat. He was going to bear witness. The farmyard was a scene of grim finality. All of Slater's magnificent machinery, the symbols of his ambition, were lined up in neat funereal rows. The John Deere 4640, its tires caked with mud, its windows dusty. The Gleaner N6 combine, its massive grain head resting on blocks, looking like a great, sleeping insect. The Brent grain wagons, the disc chisel, the planter. Each piece had a number taped to it. Men in seed corn hats and insulated coveralls walked silently among the iron, kicking tires and talking in low voices. It felt less like an auction and more like a wake. Silas saw Warren standing near the machine shed, his shoulders slumped, his face ashen. He was a king surveying the ruins of his kingdom. His wife, Helen, stood beside him, her face a mask of strained composure. But her eyes were red-rimmed and lost. Silas walked over, his boots crunching on the frozen gravel. "Warren," he said, his voice soft. Slater looked up. The arrogance was gone. The pity was gone. All that was left was a raw, gaping wound of a man. "Silas," he rasped, "come to pick over the bones?" "No," Silas said simply. "I came to see a neighbor." A dry, rattling sob escaped Slater's throat. "You were right," he whispered, his voice cracking. "God, you were right all along. I wasn't building an empire. I was building a prison. Every payment, another bar on the window. I had to run faster and faster just to stay in the same place." Then the music stopped, and I was the one left without a chair. He gestured at the rows of equipment. This isn't progress, Silas. It's an anchor. A big, green, expensive anchor, and it dragged me right to the bottom." The auctioneer started his rhythmic, hypnotic chant. The bidding began. The prices were heartbreaking. Equipment that had been purchased for $100,000 just a few years before was selling for $20,000 or $30,000. The bankers stood by with their clipboards, their faces impassive, ticking off the assets. They weren't selling machinery. They were liquidating a dream. Silas watched as the 4640 was sold to an out-of-state investment group for a fraction of its worth. He saw the pain on Slater's face as the combine he had been so proud of was driven away by a stranger. This wasn't just a financial loss. It was a public stripping of a man's identity, his pride, his very reason for being. While the world of high finance and leveraged assets was burning down around him, Silas's world remained small, solid, and secure. The following week, with the spring thaw beginning to soften the ground, he was in his shed. He had the cylinder head of his old Farmall M on the workbench. He was lapping the valves, a slow, methodical process. He'd put a dab of grinding compound on the valve face, insert it into the guide, and work it back and forth with a suction cup tool. The gentle, rhythmic, scraping sound was one of maintenance, of preservation. He wasn't spending thousands on a dealer repair. He was spending a few dollars on a tube of grinding compound and a head gasket. He wasn't waiting on a part from a warehouse 1,000 miles away. The parts were in his hands. He wasn't paying interest to a bank. He was investing his own time, his own skill, into a machine that belonged to him and him alone. His hands, stained with grease and grime, were the very hands that kept his farm alive. While Slater's modern machines had become his masters, Silas's old iron remained his servant. In the quiet solitude of his shed, surrounded by the tools his father had used before him, Silas knew a kind of wealth that could never be listed on a balance sheet. He was free. The auctioneer moved on from the machinery to the land itself. The farm was being broken up, sold parcel by parcel. The homestead, with the house and the big new machine shed, was sold first. Then came the 80 acres just west of Silas's property, the old Miller place, the first piece of land Warren had bought in his quest for expansion. "All right, folks, next up we have tract number 2, the auctioneer called out, his voice booming through the cold air. 80 acres, more or less. Good, flat, black dirt. Who'll start the bidding for me at $500 an acre?" An older man in a suit, a man Silas recognized as a lawyer for the bank, immediately called out, "500!" A few other bids came in, pushing the price to 600, then 650. The crowd grew quiet. This was rock bottom. Land that would have brought $3,000 an acre just 3 years ago was struggling to fetch a quarter of that. Silas saw a couple of other local farmers shake their heads and drop out. They were stretched too thin themselves. The banker's lawyer looked confident, ready to scoop up the land for the bank at a bargain price. Silas felt a slow burn of anger. He thought of Old Man Miller, who had carved this farm out of the prairie. He thought of his own father, and the belief that the land should be cared for by those who worked it, not by a ledger book in a distant city. He had been saving his money during the good years, tucking it away in savings bonds and certificates of deposit. He hadn't bought a new truck or a lake cabin. He had built a fortress of cash, and now the time had come to use it. $700, Silas said, his voice clear and steady. Every head turned to look at him. The banker's lawyer raised an eyebrow, surprised. Warren Slater, standing by himself near the back, looked at Silas with a stunned expression. $700 from Mr. Blackwood, the auctioneer sang out. Do I hear $750? The lawyer nodded. $750. $800, Silas said immediately, without hesitation. The lawyer conferred with the banker beside him. They were used to scaring off the locals. They weren't prepared for a farmer to be bidding with cash, with confidence. $850, the lawyer said, his voice a little tighter. $900, Silas replied, his eyes locked on the auctioneer. He wasn't just bidding on land, he was making a stand. A murmur went through the crowd. This was real money now. The lawyer looked flustered. He hadn't been authorized to go this high. He shook his head at the auctioneer. Sold, the auctioneer cried, his gavel cracking down, for $900 an acre to Silas Blackwood. A smattering of applause broke out from the farmers in the crowd. It wasn't just for Silas. It was a small victory against the impersonal forces that were crushing them all. Silas walked to the clerk's table and wrote a check for the down payment from a checkbook that was not overdrawn. Later, as the crowd was dispersing, Silas found Warren Slater leaning against the empty machine shed. "Why, Silas?" Warren asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Why'd you do that?" "It's good land," Silas said. "It ought to be farmed by a farmer." He paused, then looked Slater in the eye. "The bank will let you and Helen stay in the house for a while, but you'll need work. I'll need someone to help me on that 80. I'll rent it to you, Warren. A fair cash rent. Give you a chance to get back on your feet." Warren Slater stared at him, his mouth agape. He had treated this man with scorn and condescension for years, and now, in his moment of total ruin, Silas was offering him not pity, but a hand up. A tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. "I don't understand," he stammered. "We're neighbors," Silas said, as if that explained everything. "That's got to mean something." In the years that followed, the story of Silas Blackwood became a local legend. The man they had called a dinosaur was now regarded as a prophet. As more farms went under, as the shiny new equipment was repossessed or sold for scrap, Silas's old, paid-for iron kept running. His shed became an informal community center. Younger farmers who had only ever known how to call a dealer for service would show up with a broken part in their hands. "Mr. Blackwood," they'd say, "my dad said you'd know how to fix this." And Silas would wipe his hands on a rag, look at the broken piece of steel and say, "Well, let's see what we've got." Pull up a stool. He taught them how to weld a crack, how to set the timing on an old gas engine, how to rebuild a carburetor. He wasn't just fixing machines. He was passing on a nearly forgotten gospel of self-reliance. Time moved on. The 1980s gave way to the 90s. The farm economy slowly healed, but it was a changed world. The scars remained. Warren Slater never farmed on his own again, but he worked for Silas for 5 years, a quiet, humbled man. He eventually took a job managing the co-op, and everyone said there was no man more cautious or better with a budget. He and Silas remained neighbors, bound by a shared history of ruin and grace. One warm summer evening, years later, Silas stood in the doorway of his shed, watching his son, David, who was now a young man himself. David was bent over the engine of the old Farmall M. The tractor had been repainted, its Farmall red gleaming under the single light bulb, but it was the same machine, the same engine Silas had rebuilt with his own hands all those years ago. David was carefully setting the valve lash, just as Silas had taught him. He'd tap the feeler gauge, turn the adjusting screw a fraction of an inch, and tighten the lock nut. "Think that's about right, Dad," David said, looking up, his young face smudged with grease. Silas walked over and placed a hand on the tractor's warm hood. "Your grandfather bought this tractor new in '51, he said, his voice softer now, weathered by time. "He paid for it with 2 good years of corn. When he gave it to me, it was mine. No strings attached." He looked at his son. "There was a time when everyone told me to get rid of this old thing, to buy a new one, a bigger one. They said I was being left behind." He patted the hood again. "But this tractor, it taught me something important, son. It taught me the difference between looking rich and being free. A man who owes the bank for his house, his land, and his machines. He's just a sharecropper with a fancy title. His sweat belongs to them first." "Our sweat," Silas said, gesturing around the old farm. "It belongs to us." David nodded, his eyes showing he understood. He wasn't just looking at a machine, he was looking at a legacy. He was looking at the story of his family, written in iron and oil and dirt. Silas looked out past the shed, across the fields of dark green corn, rustling in the evening breeze. He saw the 80 acres that had once been the Miller place, now his. He saw the barn with its new tin roof, paid for with cash. He saw the house where he had raised his family, a house that had no mortgage. He wasn't a tycoon, he didn't have an empire. But everything the light touched, from the fence post to the horizon, was his. Truly his. And in the quiet hum of the cicadas and the distant lowing of a cow, Silas Blackwood knew a profound and unshakable peace. The old Farmall sat silent in the shed, a faithful, paid-for servant, a testament to the simple, enduring truth that the race isn't always won by the swift, but by the steady.